All right, thanking God for Himself, the Father, likewise the Son and the Holy Spirit, all one. But they each have roles that, if you live long enough, you appreciate individually. And by the time we get to First Corinthians 12, when he talks about the spiritual gifts, that whole concept of out of many one, we call it e pluribus unum in the States. That's a biblical concept in chapter 12. And so here, even before we get there, as we look at First Corinthians chapter 10, the unique role that each of them play in guiding me, I guess, get an appreciation for at certain points. And probably not the least of which being chapter 10, because it took me a while to get through studying this one. And I don't have a clear idea of where this summary or whatnot is going to end up, but I just want to go ahead and title it and see where we, like I said, where we end up. So let's title our discussion of First Corinthians chapter 10, The Wilderness. I'm just going to get into the summary where, just kind of roughly, the first 5 verses are going to, among other things, emphasize that concept of the wilderness, and we'll go back to it because periodically the wilderness, as the Bible Project has just dropped a video within the last month or so, is a place where God will both test and expose the character of his people. And that's going to be an example here for the New Testament church, or the church at Corinth specifically, because in verses 6 through 13, he is literally going to say that the things he's talking about in the first 5 verses from Israel's history in the wilderness are an example for the church at Corinth, and quite likely, because it's been recorded for us, it's an example for us as well. One of the things he's going to say that the wilderness exposed in them was a desire for evil that's going to manifest itself in some specific ways. And he is going to say that is an example, ending up in the famous passage, take heed lest you fall as well, talking specifically to the Corinthians. But he's going to say the silver lining is God will make an escape for all of those different types of temptations that are quite possibly manifestations of the desire for evil that can be exposed or outed in the wilderness of life. As verses 14 through 22 are going to say, in particular of the ones he names, flee idolatry. And it's not just idolatry, but he's going to specifically mention the pagans who are fully devoted to idolatry. And by implication, he is going to seem to warn them to be careful of their connection to pagans who are still fully committed to idolatry. And that's not just going to be an issue here. He is going to circle back to that in the second, what we have as the second letter to Corinth, but there seems like there were more than just 2 letters. So by the time you get to chapter 6, he's going to have to emphasize this again more directly, because it's going to seem to be an issue that he tries to deal with delicately here, but delicately didn't get it done. And so it's going to end the way he deals with it here. Like we said, it's going to be subtle, but it is going to still provide them some freedom. Understanding that, as we mentioned in chapter 8's discussion of food sacrificed to idols, location is going to be important. So he's going to be careful to warn them that their presence in the places where the pagans are offering food to idols is going to potentially offer an endorsement that they need to be careful of. But it's not all foods sacrificed to idols, because in verses 23 through 30, the location is going to shift, and therefore his advice is going to shift, because he's going to say in the meat market, as we mentioned in our discussion of chapter 8, you don't have to source the meat to make sure it wasn't sacrificed to an idol. Likewise, if a non-believer invites you to eat in their home, you don't have to ask where the meat came from. But if somebody brings it up, don't let your indulgence of your freedom to actually eat that meat that came from the meat market encourage someone, as we mentioned before, who might not have a clear conscience as to whether or not they should be eating meat sacrificed to idols, even if they're not in the location where an idol is being worshipped or glorified. As the last few verses, verses 31 through 33, we're going to talk about the way in which that all sums up in a similar commandment, the way that Jesus summed up the law. Love God, love people. He is going to say, do all things for the glory of God. And likewise, he himself is telling you these things because he does these things not out of self-interest, but to make sure that he can look out for the best interest of the churches, or those who are trying to grow in their relationship with God. And so I'm almost at the 5-minute mark, and I haven't even gotten to my themes, but I do want to circle back and talk about some of the themes that I saw as being important. Going back to that whole concept of the wilderness, we have already talked about the way that The Bible Project, I think, did a really good job of talking about three particular times that the wilderness exposed some things in God's people. One, when Moses, because of his mistake or his overzealousness in killing the Egyptian that had abused the Hebrew, he was driven out to the wilderness because of that mistake. Likewise, the children of Israel, after he had essentially been restored to fulfill God's purpose in leading them out of Egyptian captivity, they went through the wilderness, not through any fault of their own, but to filter some things out of them that they did not need to carry into the promised land once they were no longer slaves, but their own nation. And then finally, they referred to the Christ who went out to the wilderness, clearly not for any sin of his own, but later on, we'll see the Hebrew writers say that he was perfected by the things that he suffered. One of those things quite possibly being his 40 days and 40 nights fasting in the wilderness before he was tempted by the enemy. And so with all of that, the wilderness exposed some things in his people. One of those parallels is he's going to specifically say in those first 5 verses of chapter 10 here that they were all baptized into the cloud. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. Those are parallels to us as New Testament believers. So when in verse 6, he shifts to specifically say, now these things took place as examples for us, it's not just, once again, a history lesson. There are some parallels to New Testament believers who, by the time we get to chapter 12, he's going to say, we were all baptized. And here he's literally going to say in a couple of segments where it's not literally referring to communion, but he's going to say in verse 14, that third section, or is it 16, the cup of blessing that we bless, and then the bread that we break. Those are parallels to just as they were baptized in a certain way coming out of Egypt, and they had something similar as Christ fed them in the wilderness and provided them drink. Understand that just the same way that they partook in all those same things, but still fell in the wilderness because that one generation fell, being marched around the wilderness 40 years. He's saying likewise, leading into, as we mentioned before, that famous warning, the summary of why he's telling them this story in verse 12. If anyone thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. Reminding me of what we saw, I think it was back in chapter 3, where we talked about that whole concept of building on a foundation. And there is a level of error that we can engage in Christians in building in an errant way when the fire or the fiery trials of life can expose that we haven't been exactly building in a way that fully honors God. He says we can still be saved even though our work might be lost. But he goes on in the very next paragraph to talk about the way in which don't take that for granted, because there is a way that you can go about doing things that are actually destructive to God's work that will tempt him or encourage him to likewise repay you or repay us with destruction. And so likewise here, when Paul is giving that warning about take heed lest we fall, there's a generation that fell in the wilderness in spite of their parallels to us, having been baptized and then likewise participating in what we would call the Lord's Supper. So with that, the thing that I guess caught my attention most is one of the things that I guess I already mentioned. He is warning them in figures of speech here delicately. But much like we saw with the reference to a previous letter where he warned them about sexual immorality, only to seem to have that issue get worse by the time he pens this letter, 1 Corinthians, where he's directly addressing a young man who has had his father's wife. And so likewise here, he seems to be taking an incremental approach, not directly going at this whole issue of idolatry as directly as he goes to the issue of sexual immorality earlier in the letter. He deals with the whole issue of idolatry gently here in 2 chapters, only to have it seem to get worse by the time he writes 2 Corinthians. And so I guess the lasting lesson for me is a practical lesson for all of us. Much like we said in a previous chapter, there are times when you shouldn't be surprised if common sense just regularly gets dismissed in certain situations. Likewise here, it's important to speak the truth in love, but don't be surprised when you also need God to give you the added measure of patience and endurance to accomplish what he has for you to do, which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please let us not forget to beg you to help us speak the truth in love, but also to have the patience and endurance to finish what you have for us.